Hello, everybody. Today, I want to talk about arguments, and in particular, analyzing arguments, recognizing arguments, restating arguments. Arguments are can run from fairly simple to incredibly complex, but they are part of human reasoning, part of human understanding. It's an important skill to have. If you're a student, oftentimes we think about, our majors or possibly our minors, and what do I need this class for, and what do I need this class for? A lot of, say, if you're in a professional arena and you work for this business or that institution, it's very easy to say things like, well, I don't need this or I don't need that because it's not labeled as this or labeled as that. Arguments are something that humans involve themselves in. It's part of sort of who we are. You make arguments every day. You hear them every day, whether you recognize them or not. And that's kind of what this is about. Obviously, if you're a student, particularly in a philosophy class, but more generally, this is for you. So let's go ahead and switch over here. I'll take you through a little PowerPoint, and we're going to. I'm going to show you a paragraph and talk about in a second. And when you read it, you'll be able to pause the video. And this is kind of what we want to do. We want to determine whether or not there's an argument. Of course, if you're watching this and you see the title, there'll probably be a very obvious answer here. But when you're looking at something, when you're hearing something, when you're reading something, right, you want to ask, is there an argument present or not? There's some other questions we can ask, but is there an argument present? In our example, we're going to ask, if there's not, what is the paragraph doing? We'll ask the question, what role do each of the sentences play? You can already get an idea from this that paying attention to what you're doing, reading very carefully, is going to be sort of really important here. There is an argument, similar process here. We need to evaluate the sentences. We need to understand each sentence. We need to begin a process of elimination, eliminating sentences that are not significant or that are rhetorical or that really serve no purpose in terms of how an argument functions. It's not informative. They're not connected to each other. It doesn't go toward establishing a conclusion. And then when we've done all that, then we are going to want to list the premises, list the conclusions, and then through this process, we do this a few times. We're going to end up with a couple of different versions of an argument before we come to a final one. And this should be true of most of what we do. So let me show you the paragraph now. So have a read of this. Feel free to stop it. I'm going to move on very quickly here in just a second. But please pause it, read it, and I really do suggest you read it. The rest of the video, you will benefit most if you stop and read this paragraph. So have a pause right now. I'm going to continue because obviously you can just pause it. So what we're looking at now is a short little piece. So let's begin our analysis. A short little piece that you might find on a blog post, or that someone might have said on a podcast, perhaps a politician during a rally of some sort, and so on and so on. Maybe your classmate or a parent or something like that. So this doesn't seem, on the face of it, too complicated, but we do have to ask what's going on here. There's some questions, right? What's going on? Is anything being argued for? Is there a main claim? Is there a main contention? If there is, are there sentences in here that support the truth of those claims? Is there supporting information or supporting evidence, and so on? Is there anything in here that is not necessary, that's maybe rhetorical or doesn't really serve a purpose in terms of an argument? Lot to ask here. So we're going to take this quite literally sentence by sentence. So let's have a look at our first sentence here. And I've obviously already done this work, so let's single that out and let's add some commentary. What happens to cigarette smoke in the air? It's a perfectly legitimate question. It's an investigative question. It's a possible point of research. We tend to care about our health, generally speaking. Cigarette smoke, maybe not so much these days, but not too long ago. Within the past 20 years, um, getting rid of cigarette smoke and places where people smoke was a big deal. And these days, particularly if you're in big cities, it's rather odd to find a place that lets you smoke inside. Without having being in a separate part of the building or an area that's outside, even though it's enclosed and so on. Perfectly legitimate question. We continue. Now, this next piece here, the logical and obvious thing right away, this language is what we might call leading. It's suggesting an answer already. What happens to cigarette smoke in the air? The logical and obvious thing. So we might single this out and say this is a rhetorical device. It's an attempt to play to your sense of being smart, right? But the fact is, it's not so obvious, right? It's not so obvious that we can just dismiss secondhand smoke as some type of threat. And this language, the logical and obvious answer that cigarette smoke is immediately diluted by the surrounding air, it's leading you, it's making you feel like it's absolutely obvious. You don't really need to think about it. It just becomes dilute. My story is done here. My work here is done. In fact, right? If it's a fact, it's something that needs some type of investigation. And so we can strike that out because it doesn't do any work here. It's purely rhetorical, meaning it's just a way to convince you without any logical argumentation. This next bit here, then, cigarette smoke is immediately diluted by surrounding air. This is an important claim relative to the question what happens to smoke in the air and whether secondhand smoke is harmful. And so we can keep it. It's a proposition. It seems to be a fact. Now, whether it's true or not is another story. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying it's false, but we can call it, at least tentatively, a fact. It's the type of sentence that's either true or either false. And if it is true, it says something important about what happens to cigarette smoke in the air. And so we can keep that. So we just underline it in blue here. Let's continue. And measurements of cigarette smoke in the air taken under realistic conditions show again and again that there's minimal tobacco smoke in the air we breathe. One of the first things we note, and we're just taking this as is because in real life you might be presented with something like this. The fact is that there is no information given to us in what's here that's given to us that backs this claim up, that supports this claim. It's the first thing we notice, right? Let's get some commentary here. But really, even if there was, this is just another way of saying that cigarette smoke is dilute. Measurements of cigarette smoke in the air taken under realistic conditions show again and again there is minimal tobacco smoke in the air. That is just another way of saying that cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. It's redundant. And so we don't need it because it doesn't say anything different than the blue underlined. So we can get rid of it. It's unnecessary. It's already been said before. Nothing new is being said. Let's continue. In fact, based on one study, which measured nicotine in the air, it has been said that a non-smoker would have to spend 100 straight hours in a smoke-filled room to consume the equivalent of a single filter-tipped cigarette. Now, what we notice with this sentence here We read it carefully. Let's read it again. What does it say? It says, based on one study, again, given what we have here, um, which might happen in real life, right? There's no actual information that they give us to support this claim here. But what does the claim say? Which measured nicotine in the air, you would have to spend 100 straight hours in a smoke-filled room to get the equivalent of a filter-tip cigarette. Look, that's just another way of saying that cigarette smoke is dilute, right? Now, the 100 straight hours claim is, or I should say, would be informational if it's actually true. We don't know right now whether it's true or not. It would be, but it's still it's still a rhetorical claim. It's rhetoric aimed at sort of just convincing you with some nice sounding language. So here we have two sentences back to back that that simply say cigarette smoke is dilute. They both reference measurement of smoke in the air, and they mark that measurement as being low. That's another way of saying dilute, and so it hasn't added anything into what's being said. There is no new information that is being added, and nothing to support the original claim that cigarette smoke is immediately diluted by the surrounding air. It's just two more ways of saying the same thing. Let's continue. That's what we mean by minimal. So the problem here then is, again, this just means dilute. So he's defining, he or she or they are defining what minimal means, and so we've already dealt with that. Nothing new has been added. So, does cigarette smoke endanger non-smokers? Now, it's another question. First question is, what happens to cigarette smoke in the air? Here's another question. Does cigarette smoke endanger non-smokers? Rhetorically speaking, they would probably have you say no. Why? Because of what came before it. Three claims that smoke is immediately diluted in the air. If regular smoke is dangerous for you, then the diluted smoke presumably is either less dangerous or not dangerous. That's the point. That's the point of priming you like that with that type of language. That, oh, it just gets diluted in the air. So does cigarette smoke endanger non-smokers? So this is an important question. It needs to be answered. So does it endanger non-smokers? In his most recent report, the Surgeon General, no fan of smoking. This is interesting. No fan of smoking. Again, this is irrelevant. It's just more rhetoric. Not being a fan of smoking, right? There's no relationship to whether smoking is bad for you or not. There's no relationship to how dilute smoke is when it hits the air. It's just rhetoric saying the most prominent, possibly the most powerful medical doctor in the nation happens not to like smoking. It's meant to encourage the idea that it's probably a bad thing. And it very well may be. That's not our point right now. Our point is that being a fan of smoking or not is irrelevant to whether smoking is good for you or not. So we take that out. So in his most recent report, the Surgeon General said that the available evidence is not sufficient to conclude that other people's smoke causes disease in non-smokers. Now, this is an interesting claim. It's an important claim, and it's relative. If that claim were true, that would be important. It would, and it's important relative to the question of what happens to smoke in the air and whether secondhand smoke is harmful or not. And so we're going to leave this. This is important. If the Surgeon General claims that, and it's true, that's information we need to know regarding what happens to smoke in the air and whether it's harmful to you or not. Our last sentence here. In our view, smoking is an adult custom, and the decision to smoke should be based on mature and informed individual freedom of choice. So in the first case, in the first point here, like sure, sure, but it's kind of trivial. This is what we want for adults. This is what we expect of adults, that they would make mature and informed choices. And given where we live in the world here in the United States, we have certain notions of freedom. It's not univocal, and we mean different things sometimes when we talk about freedom, but we still do share some sort of general sense of freedom. So this sentence isn't telling us much either. It's just sort of a definition of what we mean by an adult. More importantly, this is just an opinion. It's an opinion. In our view, smoking is a custom and a decision that should be based on mature and informed choice. Right? Oh, great. That's great. We might even agree with it. Has nothing to do with the question of what happens to smoke in the air, and nothing to do with whether secondhand smoke is harmful for you. Right? Right? So we notice one more thing here. The claims about custom, mature and informed freedom, again, have nothing to do with these questions of harm. So here's a bit of an analysis. We're not done. It's just kind of an initial um, take there's more to come here in just a second. It's an initial take um, uh, uh, on something that might be presented to you. Again, it might be a fellow student, it might be a parent, it might be a conversation somewhere, it could be a blog post, right? Um, uh, I actually forgot where this particular example came from, so I've been using it for a while now, but um, it's an interesting thing. And one of the reasons it's so interesting, and we're going to come back to it here in a second, is because it's very complicated. There's actually a lot going on in that small little paragraph. Now, if you know anything about me, if you're one of my students or have been one of my students, or if you're just finding this channel, um, I will always, like, one thing I always try to get people to understand is that this world is a complicated mess, right? And it gets more complicated the more you look at it. Simple seeming answers, simple seeming solutions are usually just that. And when someone presents those to you and make it seem simple, that ought to be a red flag for you. Yeah. So one reason I like this example is because it is in fact very complicated. It shows how something very seemingly simple, once you stop, take a step back, and actually ask yourself some questions about this sentence by sentence, you realize it's actually complicated and you have work to do. Another thing it shows us is that it takes time. It takes time, and it takes a concerted amount of effort to actually go through that stuff. And if you're not paying attention, I think maybe it shows us a third thing. If you're not paying attention to what you're doing or to what other people are saying and what you're doing relative to it, or maybe you're tired when you're reading or something like that, maybe you're in a different sort of mood, you could be easily swayed by certain types of rhetoric. And so I love this example here. Um, I think it shows us a lot. So let's go back to it real quick, and then I'm going to continue here. So yeah, real complex. There's a lot of work to do, even with something very simple seeming as that. Okay. Now, in the previous slide, as we saw, we accomplished a couple of things. One, we evaluated all the sentences and we eliminated those that played no significant part in the argument. Remember, you can go back to the previous part of this video where I asked that this is one of the things that we need to be able to do. We need to now accomplish the following. We need to list the premises and list the conclusion or conclusions. Now, this argument and what we're doing here, I could spend another hour, hour and a half, possibly 2 hours on. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything that we could do in terms of argumentation and logic, even fallacies and so on. There's actually a lot in this. So what we're going to do is going to be a little limited, but I do want press upon you. Um, there is something else going on in this short example and paragraph. So let's start by asking, as we've analyzed it so far, what are we left with? So I think we can say the following. What do we have left? First, we seem to have an initial question. Does cigarette smoke endanger non smokers? That's how the thing gets started in the first place. Fair enough. Now we need to ask what you might call a tag question. So, any piece of information or even other questions and so on, you always, as a critical reasoner, you always need to ask questions. Ask further questions, right? In this case, if the initial question is, does cigarette smoke endanger non smokers? When we take a look at the piece as a whole, it tells us that that is a question that that piece addresses. Well, we need to ask, what is being argued for? Because that's a question. A question isn't a claim, it's not a proposition, it's not a fact, it's not a statement, right? It can be, and we can make it into a statement. So, with that leading question, does cigarette smoke endanger non-smokers? And we look at the paragraph as a whole. Let's ask, well, what is actually being argued for? After our analysis, what is being argued for? What's the main point? What's the main contention of the piece? Why would the author or authors write that piece, and what are they trying to convince you of? You need to ask these questions of anybody if you're going to consider yourself to be a critical reasoner. Well, it might seem as if what is being argued for is that there is no evidence that secondhand smoke endangers non-smokers. Now, this we recognize as um, a sentence that makes a claim about something. It's a proposition, to use the philosophical term. In grammar, it's a declarative sentence. It claims that the world is a certain way. In particular, it says that there is no evidence, there's no information, there's no reasons that support the claim that secondhand smoke endangers non-smokers. That's something that can be argued for, and it seems to be that's what the authors of this little piece um, want you to believe, want you to accept as true. Uh, we could interpret it a little bit differently, a little bit stronger, possibly a little more rhetorically here, and we could say cigarette smoke does not endanger non-smokers. Now, I say we could put this more rhetorically because it seems like this might be what they want, given the language of what we read. This might be where they're going, but they don't come right out and make a claim that says cigarette smoke does not endanger non-smokers. Now, remember, we're just saying, what are they arguing for here? We're not constructing the argument yet. We're not extracting the argument from the piece. We're just sort of thinking about what they might be asking you to be is true. What are they asking you to accept? Okay. Then we ask again, if one of these two are actually what they're asking you to believe, the conclusion, if one of those two sentences is actually the conclusion and they want you to believe that there's no evidence that the secondhand smoke endangers non-smokers, then we can ask, what reasons do they give you that support that claim? Right? And again, this applies to anybody, professors, priests, pastors, politicians, parents, it doesn't matter, whatever professionals there are. Right? Someone makes a claim, you have a right to ask what reasons are in support of that claim. And if they give bad reasons or no reasons or good reasons, then we need to make adjustments in our beliefs and our reasoning process accordingly. But if someone says something, if someone puts it out there and makes a claim about something, you have an absolute moral and philosophical right to ask what reasons do they have that support that claim. And it's incumbent upon you to make sure that those reasons are actually good, which means you have more work to do intellectually. And so that's where we're at right now. What reasons do the authors give or author give in support of this claim? And the answer seems to be two claims that come directly from that text that we just read. One is that cigarette smoke is significantly diluted by the surrounding air, and that the Surgeon General supports the claim that cigarette smoke is significantly diluted by the surrounding air. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Let's rework this information. And remember, let me back up here. We got this from this examination, right? We got this from basically what's in blue here and striking out all the stuff that's either redundant or not necessary. And what's left is what is in blue here. And so that's where we are getting this information in green. It comes straight from that. So again, feel free to pause, go back, and look at this more if you need to. Now that we have this information, let's begin construction of an argument. So when we rework it, we can write things like this. Let's be a little more formal. So we're going to put a 1 here. So this is our first premise. This is premise number 1. And it says cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. Now, we're not saying it is true. We're not saying it's not true. We don't know the status of whether this is true or not. We're just listing it as a premise. It's a claim, it's a proposition, and we can question whether it's true or false later. Right now, it is something that is being said as a fact that is being used in support of another claim. Our second premise, the Surgeon General confirms that the cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. I added that word. If you go back and look at what the original little paragraph there, this seems to be what they mean, that the Surgeon General in his latest report says he's confirming that cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. There's some wiggle room there for how you would use the language. Maybe there's a different word. You don't have to formulate the words precisely this way. We want to maintain the truth value of what is being said. And so there's a little bit of wiggle room for how you reword this, as long as we are charitable in our interpretation and we make sure that however we word it, we make sure that we're saying what the author intended to say, and we're not creating a straw man. We're not adding information or changing things or having the audience think something else when the author really meant this. Right? It's a skill we have to learn, and we want to be fair, whether you like it or not. If you're representing other people's arguments, you need to make sure that you are representing them fairly. Therefore, given premise 1, given premise 2, therefore, cigarette smoke does not endanger non-smokers. Okay? So we need to ask ourselves at this point, if 3 is our conclusion, if this is indeed what the authors are asking us to believe, is it legitimate to believe 3 given that 1 and 2 are true? Let's assume that 1 and 2 are actually true. If they were true, would 3 be true? Or is there something going wrong here? So let's assume that cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. Now, in that piece, they didn't say to what extent necessarily. They gave no actual measurements or anything. They didn't talk about what harmful levels of pollution were. They didn't talk about what safe levels of dilution were. They didn't talk about any of that. They just said it's immediately diluted in the air. And I mentioned that this is sort of rhetoric to make it seem like it's not harmful, that it's safe. But let's ask. Let's assume it is diluted. We don't know how diluted it is, right? The Surgeon General confirms apparently that it's diluted to a significant extent. But if 1 is true, does that mean 3 is true? Given the information we have, it doesn't seem like it. And 2, right? And 2 is interesting. 2 is going to seem like it's just confirming 1. right? And I'm not sure that that's necessarily another premise. Although the way it's set up, the way it's in the reading we have, we can extract it, and it does look like a premise. It's offered as a separate claim, but I'm not so sure here that these are actually two separate premises. Two seems to be how you would actually confirm one. You would need another premise, meaning that there's no extra information here necessarily. So even if two um, and one are true, all one and two say is that cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. As is, it says nothing about how diluted it is, what the measurements are, what actually is harmful, what actually is not harmful, either in the piece or in the argument. So we ask, if the premises were true, would the conclusion be true? As is, it doesn't seem like it. We need more information. So let's reform the argument. Let's add what needs to be um, what needs to be present. So certainly, we can say that that the cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. Not that it's fact, but this is a premise. This is what the author is stating as fact. Whether it's true or not is another story, right? They make the claim that the Surgeon General basically confirms that cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air, so we're going to leave that here. Then notice this, and we put this in parentheses. This is an implied premise, meaning that it's in the piece. It's not explicit, meaning you don't see it. It's not written for you, but it's there. It's in the reasoning. It's between the lines. You have to see what sort of isn't there. And in fact, this sentence needs to be true along with 1 and 2 if the conclusion is going to be true. And so we need to add that bit of reasoning. And we ask ourselves now, if 3 and 1 and 2 are true, would 4 be true? Not is it true, but would it be? So, if cigarette smoke is dilute, then cigarette smoke does not endanger non smokers. Cigarette smoke is dilute by the surrounding air. The Surgeon General confirms that cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. Therefore, cigarette smoke does not endanger non smokers. Now, with that piece of rhetoric, now we have an argument, and in fact, we have a valid deductive argument. There's some information here I'll get to here in just a second. So we're going to need to rework this a little bit, but now we have an argument that is an actual valid deductive argument. For the conclusion does actually follow from the premises. But let's examine this. Number 2 here. What purpose does this sentence serve? It's basically the same as saying that 1 is true. It's rhetorical. It doesn't add any information. It doesn't do any more, because even if it is true, all it says is cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air. It's a redundancy. Now, how we prove 1 is going to depend. We prove 1 by things like 2. We prove 1 by other methods, by other researchers, other studies, and so on. We prove 1 by other extraneous examples, as in, I don't know, people dying from secondhand cigarette smoke that's documented and so on. So we can't just use the Surgeon General as absolute confirmation. We need more than that. But if it's true, all it's going to confirm is 1. And so its only real purpose is rhetorical. It's just a way of convincing you. No new information has been added, and so we can actually get rid of that, and we're going to. What about 3 here? As I said, 3 was added. It needed to be true. It needs to be true for the conclusion to follow. But it was an implicit premise. It was there in the reasoning, if you follow it and you ask yourself, what's missing? What do we need? Why is this argument not working? There's a sentence that we can supply that, if it's true, along with everything else, the conclusion would then have to follow. But it was in the background. It was there, but it was between the lines. And it's our job to recognize that. And so we place it in parentheses as indicating that it's an implied premise, it's something that we added to it. So, what do we have? We see that there is an implied premise that we needed to explicitly state, and that one of the premises is redundant. When we go through that whole mess that we went through, and we're thinking logically about this, we're taking our time, we're doing an investigation, an intellectual investigation, we see that there are some issues with the reasoning. Once we wipe away we wipe away all the rhetoric, all the stuff that isn't necessary. We formulate it into an argument. We see what's missing. We add it. That's premise 3 there in this example. Then we see that stuff has been redundant. It's implied, and we need to do more work to have the best possible argument that this author is trying to present us. This means we can come to one final argument. So let's rewrite all of this that captures explicitly what the paragraph was trying to do implicitly. And it goes like this. So here's our final argument. If cigarette smoke is dilute, then it does not endanger non-smokers. Cigarette smoke is dilute, therefore, cigarette smoke does not endanger non-smokers. And we can see immediately that when we have properly dealt with the argument, that the conclusion does follow from the premises, in fact. This is a valid deductive argument. For those of you who want to know, this is a modus ponens argument. And it took a little bit to get there. But you have to, and once you get used to this sort of thing, you can do this a lot quicker. I'm kind of taking a long way of doing this. When you start out doing this sort of stuff, you need to go through this, and it does take time and effort. But I'm just kind of showing you what it's like to do it as quick as I can in a presentation here. But you get better at this. So there's our initial analysis. The other slides that we just went through make up the rest of the analysis. In everything we did, there are still some problems. One of the problems is that, given our example, the example about smoking, we had to do a lot of work to figure out what was being argued for. And we had to be charitable in our interpretation about what the author was trying to say. Right? There was a lot going on, and it takes time and it takes effort, and it takes a willingness to be clear about how we think about things. And you've got to be fair about it. Even if it's your opponent, right? And you don't like what they say, maybe you don't like them, maybe they're the worst person in the world. It doesn't matter. An argument's an argument, and an argument and truth and falsity, right, don't respect people's opinions. Truth has nothing to do with what you like, right? It's not a favorites game or anything like that. And if we're being honest, if we're going to be critical reasoners, we have to make sure that we are representing another person's argument, or an argument that is not our own. Let's say we need to make sure that we're representing it charitably. We need to give it the best possible interpretation, and then we can start to overcome it. We can criticize it. We can attack it. We need to capture what the author was trying to say. This meant that we had to weed through irrelevant information and text. We had to see what mattered, what didn't, and strike through and remove anything that didn't matter. We needed to isolate the important questions and the claims, and then we needed to add missing information. All of this takes knowledge of the world, right? And it takes careful reading, and it takes interpreting. Like those first two big sentences after the claim there, that smoke is immediately diluted up here, that cigarette smoke is immediately diluted in the surrounding air. This whole half the paragraph here, if you remember, is just synonymous with saying cigarette smoke becomes dilute in the air, right? And then we had to add the missing information in terms of that third premise. We had to do quite a bit of work here, all in an attempt to provide the best possible interpretation of the author's intent and purpose as we can, regardless of our own feelings and positions regarding smoking and secondhand smoke. Okay, here's our final argument again. Even though we did our best to come up with the best interpretation of the author's argument, so we did our job. We did our job. This is what the authors seem to be arguing for. We can in fact derive a valid deductive argument from it, and so that's almost as good as it gets. But we're not quite done yet. Ask yourself, is it true that cigarette smoke is diluted by the surrounding air? Now, they cite the Surgeon General. Now, disclosure here, I told you before, I've forgotten where I got this example from. I've been using it for a while, so it's probably several years old. So when they say the Surgeon General most recent report, I don't know exactly what that's referring to. But there's a sense in which it doesn't matter for the exercise that we're doing here, and I'll show you why here in just a second. Two, it doesn't matter because people still make these claims, right? This is kind of a live discussion that some people have about cigarette smoke still. Okay, ask yourself, is it true that cigarette smoke is actually diluted by the surrounding air? Is that true? How do you know? What information do you have that shows that that's true? What evidence is there actually for this claim? The author doesn't give it to you. They just sort of claim the Surgeon General's most recent report. We're going to have a look at that. But what evidence do you have? Now it's incumbent upon you as the listener, as the judger of someone's argument, whether it's good or bad. You need to do some more work and figure that out. So even though this argument is a valid deductive argument, it doesn't mean the premises are true, and it doesn't mean the conclusion is true. It just means that if the premises were true, the conclusion would be true. It's up to us. Well, it's really up to the author to state the facts and support their claims, which they didn't do, which means it's now up to us to do that. As it turns out, the CDC and the Surgeon General's report suggests that it's actually false. And I will show that to you here in just a second. Let me pull that up here. And so let me switch scenes here. So if you go to that website, let me increase it. Whoops. Let me increase it here. Okay. So as you can see, this is that exact website. I can't increase that, so you might have to do it if you can. But it's that same website. You can plug it in and get there. So this literally is the most recent report on smoking and tobacco use. And this is kind of like the synopsis here. Secondhand smoke is smoke, blah, blah, blah. Here it is. There is no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke. Even brief exposures can cause serious health problems and be deadly. Completely eliminating smoking is the only way to fully protect those who do not smoke from secondhand exposure. And they reference 1, 4, and 5 here, and we go down, all the way down. Sorry, I missed it. Right here, we go to references, click on it. 1, 4, and 5. So these are the reports that they are referencing that back up their claims. And so we would need to read this. I'm not going to do it now, obviously, because it's going to take too long. Right? And so it's really interesting. That was a quick internet search. It was a very quick internet search. And when we look at this final argument here, 2 actually seems to be false. And so if 2 is false, given given this particular argument, then so if we strike two off, three does not follow from one, because even though smoke is diluted in the surrounding air, it doesn't mean it's not harmful, right? So the argument doesn't actually work. What does all this mean? Big picture. Simply, we have a little bit more work to do. Always, always more work. But what we did was important. We were able to understand the author's main argument in a more accurate and important way. In our analysis, we honed our skills at deciding between what was a relevant fact and as opposed to either an irrelevant fact or some sort of opinion or commentary or something like that. In developing an accurate and charitable argument, we were able to better judge the strength of the argument and see that even the best version of the argument, a valid deductive argument, still relied on what appeared to be false premise. In other words, we became better thinkers and were more knowledgeable about the world because of that. And so I ask you, what more could you ask for than that? Now, there's a bit of a tour de force. I understand that. It's that was just one paragraph. Obviously, some of what I said, I'm trying to sort of instruct here, so you can take it out. The actual analysis, if I just presented, uh, you know, maybe be a little bit shorter, but you get the idea. It takes time. It takes effort. It's difficult to do this stuff. But it's so important to being a critical reasoner that we do this. Um, and this applies regardless, particularly if you're a student. I'm a professor, so I tend to think in terms of students and so on, and in academic departments and whatever. But um, uh, this applies regardless of what discipline you're in, what department you're in. This is about human reasoning. This is about human rationality. This is about a thought process. It makes you a better thinker. It makes you better able to extract information, to work with information. If you can calmly and reasonably and rationally work through this stuff and you can pinpoint where things go wrong. Does it take time? Yeah. Do you get better at it? Yes. Does it become faster? Yes. Do you do this for everything? No. Like from me to you, right? You don't do this for absolutely every belief you have. There's not enough time. You have too many beliefs, right? You wouldn't get anything done if this is all you did. But sometimes it matters, right? Sometimes it matters. Sometimes we need to take the time and the effort and do this because it increases our knowledge of the world. It increases our capacity to work in the world. And that's what I want for you. And that's why I do this. So I hope this helped. I hope you take this seriously. Please follow me. I'll be working on this channel a little bit more and trying to introduce some more content. I'm going to try to maybe focus on arguments. I'm not exactly sure, to what degree I can get things up as quickly as I want. But stay tuned. There's more coming. And if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments, and I will see you next time. All right. Take care.